Thousands of photographs of the moon taken during the first Apollo missions have disappeared without a trace. The originals have been burned, lost, or hidden? Why can't NASA explain where the films of the moon landing are? What was actually captured in the frames that we will never see again? Here is an investigation that will turn your understanding of how history is written on its head, and how it can be erased. On a typical workday in the early 2000s, a group of researchers from Australia contacted the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, with a request to provide the original video recordings of the Apollo 11 moon landing. The scientists wanted to digitally restore the films to preserve this historic moment for future generations in the highest quality possible. NASA's response stunned not only them, but the entire scientific community. The original video footage had been lost, along with thousands of photographs taken during the Apollo missions. This is not a mistake. It is not a technical glitch, a forgotten box in a warehouse, or an inventory error. This is a statement from the world's largest space agency. The photographs of the moon taken during the first expeditions have disappeared. At first, the information spread slowly. NASA did not make a public announcement right away. Everything happened somewhat reluctantly, with strained smiles from press secretaries and references to logistical problems and internal processing procedures. But the truth came out. It became clear that we were not talking about dozens or even hundreds, but tens of thousands of photographs and video recordings. The story began with NASA genuinely wanting to improve its archival records. A contract was signed with a company specializing in the restoration of analog materials. The project was named Lunar Tapes Recovery. And then, during the preparation process, a logical question arose. Where were the original tapes? The answer led to a series of even more disturbing discoveries. The key figure who first sounded the alarm was engineer Richard Navia. He had worked with NASA archives for decades and had himself been involved in developing the telemetry system for the Apollo missions. It was he who sadly admitted that the original magnetic tapes with the moon landing had been overwritten as part of a routine media recycling procedure in the late 1970s. Yes, you heard right. The media themselves, the very tapes on which the live broadcast from the moon was recorded, were reused. Something else was recorded over them. The reason? According to the official version, it was to save money. In the 1970s, NASA faced budget cuts, and it is claimed that many films were erased and rewritten due to a shortage of new media. They say that they did not realize their historical significance at the time, but this explanation leaves too many questions unanswered. Why did not only the videotapes disappear, but also the original photographs, taken with specially designed Hasselblad cameras? Why was no parallel backup storage carried out? Why did no one track the fate of the unique photos taken from the surface of the moon, including those taken with the astronauts' handheld cameras? Among the lost items were original negatives, shot on medium-format film. It was from these that the famous photographs were printed and included in school textbooks and encyclopedias. What we see today on the internet or in museums are only copies or scanned duplicates, often with reduced quality and compression. The situation took on a scandalous tone when independent researchers, including archivists, historians, and astronomers, began to investigate which images were unavailable. It turned out that these were fragments of key missions from Apollo 11, Apollo 12, Apollo 14, and Apollo 15. In particular, high-quality images with the original frame markings used for topographical research and calibration were missing. Some images were only preserved because individual scientists and engineers made petit private copies for their work. These are genuine salvaged artifacts. They formed the basis of the restored versions that NASA later released to the public. But the originals disappeared. The scandal reached the U.S. Congress. In the 2000s, a series of inquiries were initiated, and NASA had to admit, yes, we lost the original tapes and negatives. It added that there is no evidence of malicious intent, just a chain of errors, logistical complexity, and times were different. But how can one explain that not just one type of media disappeared, but entire collections of photographs? Why were some films overwritten, others lost, and still others not digitized and cannot be recovered? Against this backdrop of uncertainty, alternative versions began to emerge. Some claimed that the images contained anomalies that NASA wanted to hide. Others spoke of traces of editing that had allegedly slipped through on the original films. Still others claimed that objects of unknown origin were visible in some frames, and that this was the reason for the cleansing of history. It is hard not to notice that the more details emerge, the clearer it becomes that the information is being manually controlled. Archives are opened selectively. Some documents related to the Apollo program have still not been declassified, and the restored materials are far from everything that could be available. This raises the main question: why did this happen to the most significant event of the 20th century? Why did the originals of the flight that became a symbol of scientific and technological triumph disappear? If the moon landing is one of the proudest pages in American history, it would be logical to preserve every frame, every centimeter of film, every sound. But in reality, we have a partisan hole in our historical memory. Why? While officials talk about bureaucracy, cost-cutting, and carelessness, more and more people are asking, is there something more to it? Could it be that something that should not have been captured on film ended up in the frame? This is not an idle question. It is already being asked at conferences, raised in the media, and discussed in academic circles. And it continues to haunt journalists and ordinary viewers alike, because each of us wants to know, if we really were on the moon, where is all the evidence? To understand the scale of the loss, we first need to figure out what exactly disappeared. What kind of footage was it? How was it different from everything humanity had filmed before? Why was it unique in both a technical and historical sense? Filming the moon during the Apollo missions was no less difficult than the landing itself. The astronauts were entrusted with an incredibly important role: to document the surface of another celestial body so that people on Earth could see it with their own eyes. A special camera system was assembled for this purpose. It was not just a camera, but an engineering marvel adapted to extreme conditions. Swedish Hasselblad cameras were used, models specially modified to meet NASA requirements. These cameras were distinguished by their large-format film and exceptionally high resolution. But before being sent into orbit, each of them underwent rigorous modification. All parts that could not withstand the vacuum were removed, lubricants were replaced, and special heat sinks were added. Operating a camera in thick spacesuits is a feat in itself. The astronauts had no way of aiming with their eyes. They shot by touch, using coordinates and intuition. There was one main camera on board Apollo 11, a Hasselblad EL data camera, equipped with a 75mm focal-length lens and carrying a medium-format Ektachrome film cassette. This was slide film of the highest quality. It allowed for clear, rich images even in difficult lighting conditions. Each mission left behind dozens of rolls of film. These were images of the surface of the moon, the horizon, craters, astronauts' footprints, instruments, modules, and, of course, the Earth itself. A tiny blue ball against the backdrop of endless black emptiness. It was these images that would later become part of the golden fund of space visual culture. It was these images that were lost. But the filming was not limited to cameras. There were also television cameras installed on the lunar modules. The first live broadcasts were in SSTV format, which has a lower frame rate but high image quality. It was these signals, received at the Parkes Observatory in Australia, that were recorded on magnetic tape. These tapes, original, uncompressed, primary, contained the most detailed images of what was happening on the moon. The signal was then converted for television broadcast, and this is where the saddest part of the story begins. What millions of people saw on television was not the original, but only a reworked video signal, effectively re-recorded from the screen. Yes, NASA literally set up a camera in front of a monitor to film the broadcast, because there was no system capable of directly outputting the SSTV signal to standard televisions. Now imagine, all the original recordings, the ones from the observatory, with details that could not be reproduced later, were erased and rewritten. Instead, we are left with only screenings comparable in quality to VHS tapes. Now add to that the disappearance of the printer DD 200B photographs. Frames taken from the moon on film that was returned to Earth. Film that could have been stored for centuries. Where is it? How exactly was it lost? Some versions indicate that part of the archives were stored at the Goddard Space Center in Maryland. It is there, according to speculation, that the mass destruction or redistribution of media took place. But there are no documents confirming the destruction procedure. And without that, all we can do is take their word for it. Some researchers familiar with NASA's internal system claim that there was an party and inventory problem. In those years, the archives were rapidly expanding. There were no standards for long-term storage, and some of the films were rewritten to free up space without understanding their value. Another part disappeared when the archives were converted to digital format. Some were lost, some did not pass selection. But all this explains only a small fraction of the losses. What to do with the materials that were officially supposed to be under control, but suddenly disappeared without a trace? Where are the negatives with detailed images of the Tarsi crater? Where are the series of photographs of geological drilling at the Apollo 17 station? Where are the close-up photographs of the module that were supposed to show the landing system? When independent experts began to examine the copies provided by NASA, many questions arose. Some frames looked noisy, with suspicious retouching. Some did not have fiducial markers, special marks on the lens glass that should be present in every frame. Their absence casts doubt on the authenticity of the images. Another strange thing is light anomalies. In a number of images, the direction of the shadows does not match. One hypothesis is that this is the result of complex light reflection from the surface. Another is that it is a sign of poitillon toits. Still others claim that it is the result of digital processing in our time, but it is impossible to verify. The originals have disappeared. It is striking that some images that were previously freely available have disappeared even from Internet archives. For example, one of the panoramas taken by Apollo 15 in the Hadley Rill area suddenly disappeared from NASA's official website in the mid-2000s. No explanation was given, no comments, no redirects. In response to these claims, NASA refers to the work of the LPI, Lunar and Planetary Institute Archive, where digitized versions of the surviving images are posted. But their quality is far from original. These are copies of copies. Many are without color correction. And, most importantly, they are incomplete. Engineers who have worked with these archives say that the amount of missing material is so great that it can be described as systemic loss. This is not just a case of a few boxes going missing. This is the loss of cultural and scientific heritage on a planetary scale. And perhaps the most bitter paradox in this story is that it was only thanks to enthusiasts that some of the images could be partially restored. Private individuals who had kept microfiches, photocopies, and individual films uploaded the material to the public domain, piecing it together bit by bit. Some restored old photos by hand, scanning them on consumer scanners and posting them on forums. This is not just a fact, it is a symptom. We live in a world where private archives preserve what official history has lost, where the digital shadow of an event proves stronger than its paper trail. And while you're reading this, while you're looking at that familiar photo of an astronaut against the American flag, know that the original image may have been lost long ago. What you see before you is just a reflection in a mirror, a fragment of a great history that someone, intentionally or accidentally, has begun to erase. To understand how this is possible, how a giant space agency could lose evidence of one of humanity's greatest achievements, we need to look at NASA's data storage system. The answer is not obvious. It lies in hundreds of procedures, warehouses, protocols, and a bureaucratic maze where a document can disappear without anyone even noticing. In the 1960s and 1970s, the agency's archiving standards were not standardized. Each center, Whether it was the Johnson Space Center in Houston, the Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland, or the Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama, had its own storage system. Data was distributed among departments, laboratories, external contractors, and universities collaborating with NASA. As a result, no one had full access to all materials. Archives were stored on paper, microfilm, film, magnetic tape, and only later on the first digital media. There was simply no centralized database. Many original photos and videos from the Apollo missions were stored at the Goddard Center, where, as it later turned out, some of the materials were disposed of during media recycling in the late 1970s. How did this happen? NASA used 2-inch Ampex magnetic tapes. They were expensive and bulky. When funding for the Apollo program ended, the agency needed to free up storage space and cut costs. It was decided to reuse the old tapes by rewriting them with other data, such as satellite telemetry. This explanation sounds trivial. Too trivial to justify the disappearance of historical originals. Moreover, it turned out that there was no centralized record-keeping of the tapes. Individual copies could be issued to contractors, universities, and technical specialists without being returned or registered. Under such conditions, it is impossible to determine exactly where something was located, who was responsible for it, and when it was lost. NASA archivists acknowledged in their internal reports, storage procedures in the 1970s did not provide for the permanent storage of all data. The focus was on the operational usefulness of the information, not its historical value. This means that no one within the agency itself regarded these materials as cultural heritage. They were merely reports, technical information that could be reproduced if necessary. Employees who tried to bring order to the chaos faced a bureaucratic wall. One engineer, who wished to remain anonymous, said, "I found boxes of unaccounted-for film in the basement. I raised the issue of their contents, but was told, 'Don't waste your time. No one needs them anymore.'" This approach seemed logical at the time. Who could have imagined that half a century later, humanity would be scrutinizing every pixel of these images, searching for evidence or refutation, constructing theories, and comparing details? Some of the materials were nevertheless transferred to the National Archives and Records Administration, NARA. But even there were incidents. Some boxes of film arrived without labels, without contents, without descriptions. In some cases, the file numbers did not match the internal logs. Some of the films were damaged. They had been stored at the wrong temperature, in rooms with high humidity. It often happened that a document was listed in the catalog but could not be found when requested. Physically, it had disappeared. There was no record of who had issued it, when, or where. Only a mention. A ghost. When NASA launched a campaign to restore its digital heritage in the 2000s, it turned out that there was nothing to restore. At best, there were copies. At worst, there were only paper printouts of lost photos and scans from journals. But here's where the paradox begins. Certain materials were preserved better than others. Photos from astronaut training, for example, or documents on auxiliary projects such as Skylab. But the originals from the moon missions were the first to disappear. Why? Some independent researchers believe that this is no accident. They believe that materials that could contain visual inconsistencies, evidence of staging, filming errors, or unusual objects disappeared according to an unspoken protocol. They were not destroyed directly, but lost in a series of moves, reorganizations, and digitization. This approach has been seen before in history. For example, in the 1980s, the British Ministry of Defense destroyed hundreds of UFO reports, citing lack of space. It later emerged that these reports contained some very strange evidence. For some reason, it is precisely in those archives where maximum transparency is required that the most opaque disappearances occur. In the case of NASA, journalists' questions were answered evasively. No public investigations were conducted. Internal reports are classified. The heads of the archival departments have retired. Responsibility is spread thinly. No specific person has been held responsible for the disappearance of the originals. Another factor is the transfer of some of the materials to third-party contractors. For example, it is known that some of the tapes from the Apollo missions were sent to the University of Texas for scientific analysis. But not all of them were returned. Other recordings ended up in the hands of companies involved in sensor calibration. Sometimes they were simply not returned. Sometimes they were replaced with copies. In essence, the NASA archive is not a fortress, but a maze with scattered threads, where every thread could be cut, where copies became originals and originals disappeared. The human factor cannot be overlooked. Ordinary employees may have underestimated the importance of the materials. Someone may have mistakenly sent a box to the scrap heap instead of the warehouse. Someone may have quietly written off the films. Someone may have taken them home as a souvenir of their service. And every such step is irreversible. All this sounds like an apology for chaos. But is it really possible to believe that a government agency overseeing multi-billion-dollar launches forgot to take care of the most important thing? The evidence of those launches? The question arises again. Was it forgetfulness? Or did someone decide that truly, less evidence means fewer questions? Astronaut Buzz Aldrin, the second man on the moon, once said in an interview, "You have no idea how much we left there, but most of it we lost here on Earth." His words sound like a poetic metaphor, but in light of the lost archives, they take on a frightening meaning. We are a humanity that conquered another planet, but failed to preserve the evidence of it. Or did we not want to? Today, when any smartphone can take photos with millions of pixels, it's hard to imagine that the only photos of the moon have been lost, like a diary from a school bag. And yet, that's the reality. And with each passing year, with each move, restructuring, and server upgrade, the chances of finding anything diminish or disappear forever. But if this is an accident, it is frightening. And if it is intentional, it is twice as frightening. Until the early 2000s, almost no one knew about the disappearance of the original photographs of the moon. The information was stored deep within the agency, and only a small circle of engineers, archivists, and technical specialists had access to data indicating serious gaps in the documentation. Everything changed when people from outside the agency, scientists not directly affiliated with NASA, but highly qualified and passionate about space exploration, took on the task of restoring the historical records. One of the first alarm bells was the Lunar Tapes Recovery Project, launched in Australia. The project was initiated by Peter Robertson, an employee of the Australian Space Agency, who, together with engineer Stanley Lebedowski, wanted to digitize the original video recordings of the Apollo 11 moon landing. They contacted NASA with a request for the original magnetic tapes recorded in SSTV format from the Parkchakritstri Torchas. Parks Tordris Chief Tortritri Observatory. The response shocked them. The tapes were missing. What's more, NASA couldn't even say exactly where they should have been. This was the starting point for an investigation that gained publicity and, for the first time, called into question the ability of the world's largest space agency to preserve its own historical archives. Representatives from the University of Maryland, where work had previously been done with telemetry archives, soon joined the investigation. One of the employees, digital systems specialist John Mallon, began his own audit of the available records. He discovered that the inventory tape numbers did not match those listed in the official records, and some of the entries in the catalogs had no physical counterpart. At the same time, journalists working on the history of NASA began receiving leaks from former employees. One of them, technical consultant Richard Navia, who had worked at the Goddard Center for more than 20 years, admitted that in the late 1970s, films were indeed being rewritten on a massive scale. The reason, he said, was simple. There weren't enough tapes for new missions, so we were asked to rework the old ones. When the word rewrite leaked to the press, a scandal erupted. After all, we were not talking about duplicate recordings or backup copies, but about unique originals. Filmed at the moment when humans were actually on the moon. At first, the media covered the situation cautiously. The first publications appeared in technical publications such as IEE Spectrum and Popular Mechanics. Then the world's largest news agencies picked up the story: the BBC, Reuters, and the Associated Press. The tone of the publications ranged from cautious bewilderment to outright shock. Headlines appeared such as, "How NASA Lost the Moon," "The Films That Aren't There," and "Footprints on the Moon, Missing Evidence." The public reacted painfully to the news. Thousands of users around the world began studying old materials, comparing available copies, reconstructing chains of disappearances, and matching dates and inventory numbers. Entire forums dedicated to moon gaps appeared. One of the most famous was the English-language website, lostapollodata.net, where enthusiasts collected evidence, photographs, scans of documents, and fragments of film. In response, NASA created a temporary commission tasked with investigating what had happened to the recordings. During an internal audit in the 2000s, the commission concluded that approximately 200,000 magnetic tapes containing Apollo mission data were reused between 1975 and 1985. In other words, they were destroyed as a result of media rotation. But as soon as this report was published, attention shifted to another aspect. Why did no one know about this for so many years? Why was the loss not recorded at the time it occurred? Where was the control system? Why did this not become a subject of public discussion in the scientific community earlier? NASA's answers were predictable. Different departments were not coordinated. The archiving system was imperfect. At that time, there was a different attitude towards documents. But these explanations did not convince experts, journalists, or, even more so, critics. Independent documentaries appeared, including the Project Moon Tapes, The Lost Evidence, released in the United Kingdom. In the film, former NASA engineers spoke openly about poor data control, a lack of motivation to preserve the films, and even direct instructions to get rid of obsolete media. Interestingly, some of those interviewed believed that the materials had not disappeared by accident. One of them, a former visual processing technician, said, "There were objects on some of the films that were difficult to explain. Strange shapes, moving shadows. Perhaps someone thought it would be better to erase them than to explain them." These statements only fueled interest. Conspiracy theorists entered the fray. Topics began to appear on forums with titles such as "NASA Destroyed the Truth," "Moon Photos, Who Stole Them?" and "What Have They Been Hiding from Us Since 1960?" Some blamed the U.S. government. Others blamed international organizations. Still others blamed aliens. And although these versions are largely absurd, their widespread circulation speaks to the main point. The public does not trust official explanations. The culmination came when NASA, under pressure from the media and the scientific community, finally attempted to restore at least some of the lost data. The PTT, Apollo Archive Restoration Initiative. Project involved private companies, universities, and museum foundations. The restored versions were digitized and made available to the public. But these were only fragments, blots, shards, a mosaic from which it is impossible to piece together the original picture. The most important thing, the originals, are still missing. It is curious that since then, NASA has become much stricter in regulating access to its archives. Some researchers claim that after the incident with the moon films, the agency introduced unspoken restrictions on the copying, distribution, and publication of internal documentation. A new level of file classification appeared, and any leak was considered a potential threat to the agency's reputation. But the domino effect had already been set in motion. Journalists, bloggers, and researchers began to ask questions about other topics. Where are the original shuttle flight records from the 1980s? Where are the reports on failed missions? Where are the films from the vacuum chamber tests? And most importantly, if the evidence of the moon landing had disappeared, what else could have disappeared? So a trivial question about magnetic tape became a mati-tourne-fille, historical precedent. A precedent that showed that even the world's largest agency, which controls the fate of satellites and Mars rovers, can be vulnerable. That even the most important events can disappear into the dusty shadows of an archive shelf. Today, looking at the surviving copies, many people wonder, did it really happen? Or is all that remains just memories and GIFs on the internet? But if we don't preserve the past, if we lose it through carelessness, what kind of future awaits us? When the disappearance of the original photographs and video recordings from the moon became public knowledge, the public was divided. Some accepted the official version, human error, archiving flaws, simple negligence. Others were skeptical, and this doubt gave rise to versions that sound frightening but logical if you look at the situation from the perspective of lost trust. The first version is technical failure of the missions. According to this version, some of the footage allegedly contained evidence that the moon landing did not take place as claimed. For example, there were traces of scenery, filming equipment, and filming errors that exposed the fact that it was staged. This version is popular among supporters of the moon conspiracy. However, there is no direct evidence to support it. Nevertheless, the destruction of the originals is like adding fuel to the fire. The second version is artificial cleansing of archives of anomalous objects. Some researchers claim that some of the films and photographs may have captured unidentified flying objects, strange shadows, traces, and structures on the surface of the moon, which could have sparked global debate. To avoid panic, it was decided to silently delete the compromising footage. Fantastic? Perhaps. But if these images really existed, they are now inaccessible. The third version is the redistribution of information to closed access levels. According to this version, the original photographs were not destroyed, but transferred to closed military archives. This would explain why NASA does not disclose the exact location of the films, avoids discussion, and has still not released a number of documents on Apollo. This approach is common in national security institutions. Information is not lost, it has simply been classified. Regardless of the reason, the result is the same. We have lost not just images, but a part of history. Footage shot by people standing on the surface of another world. Unique artifacts, of which only digital shadows remain. This loss is equivalent to a library being burned down. It not only blocks access to scientific data, it destroys the belief that the truth can be preserved. Even in the age of technology, digital archives and space missions, disappearance is possible and real. And while NASA remains silent and copies of the footage are lost in the noise of the internet, only one question remains. If even such evidence can disappear, what else could we lose tomorrow? The answer depends on us.